Our next speaker is Dr. Kristina Olson, who is a soon-to-be Associate Professor of Psychology here at the University of Washington, where she directs the Trans Youth Project. Before joining us in 2013, she was an Assistant Professor of Psychology at Yale University. She received both her PhD and her master's degrees from Harvard. Dr. Olson is an expert in the domain of early social cognition, spending more than a decade understanding how children think about their own and others' social categories, including their race, their gender, and their social class. Her work in the area involves a national, longitudinal study of transgender children, which I imagine we'll hear about soon. The first publication from that work was recently accepted the highest-ranked empirical journal in psychology, psychological science. Since founding her own lab in 2008, Dr. Olson's research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Health, and other private foundations. She's been the winner of several major awards, as well as multiple dissertation awards. The Association for Psychological Science recognized her in 2011 as a rising star. It's my pleasure to present to you Dr. Kristina Olson.
I want to, before I start telling you about my project, I want to be sure to thank the Edwards family for their support in making this event possible. I also want to thank Mickey for coming here all this way from Texas to tell us about her really amazing research. But today what I want to most of all do is tell you a little bit about a new project that we've gotten off the ground in my lab since we moved here to UW about a year and a half ago. And I want to start our discussion by giving a particular example that will help you have a case in your mind for us to all kind of be on the same page in thinking about what I mean when I talk about a transgender child. This is a very powerful video made by a very powerful mom who thankfully is here tonight. And this, I think, is the single best introduction to what it might mean to be a young transgender kid that I've ever found. So I'm very fortunate that she's allowing me to share it all with you.
"6 years ago, I gave birth to my first and only child. A boy.
Hello. I am 38. I'm 29, and I really love you.
When he was 2 years old, my son began insisting on wearing only pink clothes, preferably ones with lots of sparkles and ruffles on them.
She dresses so pretty. She really loves me. She really
When he turned 3, he begged me to buy him some dresses and let him grow his hair long. That made the grandparents a little nervous, but we went with it.
That one's a fairy and that one's a princess.
Why is she a fairy and she's a princess?
Because fairies are magic and princesses don't. That's the difference. And also, they can't fly and they can. Fairies fly and princesses walk.
And then one day, in a conversation that I kind of knew was coming, but it still knocked the wind out of me, my child told me that he was actually a girl, not a boy. He looked me in the eyes and told me something had gone wrong in my tummy that made him come out as a boy instead of a girl. He wanted me to put him back. He begged me to put him back, to fix this mistake. He was 3 years old. I spent the following year resisting, trying to present alternatives. I told my child over and over again that he could continue to be a boy and play with all the Barbies he wanted and wear whatever he liked, dresses, skirts, all the sparkles money could buy. But my child said no, absolutely not. She was a girl. What are your favorite things to play with?
My princess things.
Your princess things? Why do you like princesses so much?
I just kind of do.
Do you think it's okay for boys to like princesses?
But I'm a girl.
After 12 long months of making both myself and my child miserable, I finally let my little boy go.
Goodbye. Hello. Now let's do it. Twinkle, twinkle, little star.
We switched to female pronouns and told our family and friends that she was a girl now. She wanted a new name, a girl name. At first, she picked Rainbow. I was relieved when she changed her mind and named herself after her aunt. So now I have a girl,
Talk about princesses.
a daughter.
Actually, I need to hear about how spaceships fly.
A really happy daughter.
Okay, so that is one family's story, and we're going to talk about a few families throughout my talk today. But first, before we get that far, I want to be sure to get an important point out right up front, which is that in psychology, we often make a distinction between what we call sex and what we call gender. And I'm going to simplify it a bit here, but basically what we mean by sex is really the thing that the doctor often declares that you are the day that you're born. This is usually determined by your genital presentation, and this is actually completely separate from the gender that you identify yourself as having. And now, of course, most people conflate these two because it is the case that in most people in the world, these two things are aligned. And so this can be unfamiliar to a lot of people, the idea that these two things can actually be quite separate. So the participants that I'm going to talk about today, the kids who are in our study, are kids who are transgender. And transgender are people for whom their gender identity does not match what we're going to call their natal sex. Now, this can mean that somebody identifies as male and female, that someone identifies as neither male nor female, or that somebody identifies as a gender that doesn't traditionally match their sex. I'm going to focus on this latter group today. I'm going to use the word transgender to refer to them because these are the participants for whom I'm going to talk about their data today. We are interested in other kinds of other people who identify in different ways, and we actually are recruiting them as well. But I'm going to focus on kids like the kid in the video today whose parents and doctors believed her to be male when she was born, and then she came to identify as female, as well as kids who go in the opposite direction. Importantly, I want to make a distinction. This is very different from somebody who might be identified by people as a tomboy, for example. I hear a lot of questions about that. So a tomboy, for example, is usually a girl who identifies as a girl, but has interests that we consider to be stereotypically male. But that is really different than this case, in which a child is saying, no, I am, for example, a boy. So that's the case I'm going to focus on today. Now, this seems to be a particularly important time, I think, to study transgender people, because for the first time in our culture, we're really seeing a discussion, a public discussion about transgender people. We see it in the forefront of news, entertainment, and even sports. For example, some of you might have seen last year, Laverne Cox, who's coming here very shortly, was on the cover of Time magazine, and it was in an article called The Transgender Tipping Point. Now, just in January, you might have seen that a show called Transparent that features a protagonist of a transgender woman won the Golden Globe. Last month, Obama used the word transgender for the first time in the State of the Union address. And just a week later, the Pope agreed to meet with a transgender person, spawning discussion throughout the world about transgender people and religion. Now, unfortunately, whenever there are stories like these that make it in the news, they're almost always paired with some really sad statistics. So they're often paired with statistics that present what the outcomes, what life often looks like for transgender, in particular, adults. So I'm going to present some data from not my own work. This is work that was the largest ever study of transgender adults. And what that study of 6,500 transgender adults across the country found is that they were more than 8 times as likely, nearly 40%, or over 40% of transgender people have attempted suicide. They're more than twice as likely to live on less than $10,000 a year, to be unemployed and to be homeless. And this is despite the fact that transgender people are actually more likely to go to college. In addition, they found that 47% of people have been fired, not hired, or denied a promotion because of their transgender status, something that, as Mickey alluded to, isn't illegal in many states. In addition, that 97%, or nearly every person who completed this survey, had experienced harassment or mistreatment on the job. And I think these statistics seem to be true of people's experience back when they were kids. So these same adults were asked about their experiences. And many of them said, you know, when I was a kid, I either expressed my transgender identity sometimes, or I was what was often called gender nonconforming in my kindergarten to 12th grade years. And of people who felt like they expressed their gender identity, 78% of them reported being harassed at school, 35% reported being physically assaulted, and 12% experienced sexual violence. In addition, lots of studies have actually been done with transgender teens and adults that are in domains of mental health, and they almost across the board find really high rates of depression, anxiety, suicidal behavior, and suicidal ideation. And I think this all kind of became very public with a very sad, tragic case that many of you might have heard of. This is Leila Alcorn, who made front page news. She committed suicide in December by walking in front of a semi-truck. And a day after her death, she had timed it so her suicide letter would appear online a day later. And in it, she said, amongst many other things, "My death needs to be counted in the number of transgender people who commit suicide this year. I want someone to look up at that number and say that's fucked up and fix it." And I think these are the kinds of stories and the kinds of experiences that a lot of families today that have transgender children, families like this one, this is a family of Harriet. Harriet is the daughter over on the right who identifies as transgender. And families like hers are confronted at this time with making a really big decision. They have to decide, can they change those statistics? Are there decisions that they can make that will allow their children to have the kinds of health and well-being that everybody wants for their children? And in particular, what they're trying to decide is, can supporting my child lead to better outcomes than we've seen before? And these are the kinds of families that my work at the Trans Youth Project, our organization, is trying to answer. We're hoping to one day include families in our study that will tell future parents 10 years from now what life will look like if they choose this path for their families. Now, our families vary in a lot of ways, and I'm going to talk about some of them throughout the talk. But one thing that's very common is that when they're born, the doctor has announced at birth it's a boy or it's a girl. And then what families often report is within the first couple of years, the kids in our study start to say, "No, Mom. No, Mom, I'm a girl," or "No, Mom, I'm a boy." And these kids, importantly, seem to consistently and persistently identify this way, okay? This isn't some sort of phase. This doesn't go away. Often parents expect it will. And importantly, parents react in a variety of different ways. So not every family in our study reacted the same way when this started to happen. We have some families who, from the get-go, were like, "All right, great, you're a boy," or a girl in this case. Others kind of tried to ignore it and see if it would go away. And then still others reacted negatively, often at the advice of doctors, therapists, and others. And what we found is that irrespective of their kind of first reaction, we find that a lot of these kids, their parents eventually got to a point where they said, "All right, this is who my kid is. I'm going to support my kid as they are." And those are the majority of participants in our study today. And this is the group of kids, the cohort of kids that I often refer to as gender pioneers. And the reason that I refer to them as gender pioneers is that they really are the first generation where we actually have now scores of young kids being raised, supported as their gender identity. Yet we know, in the scientific literature, we know almost nothing about them because there haven't been any systematic studies of this group of kids. In addition, we have a lot of reason to think that their experiences are going to differ a lot from 20 years ago transgender kids, because those kids didn't have this option of being supported in their gender identity in everyday life. And so we have some reasons to think that their outcomes, their well-being and their health might look a lot different too by the time that they become adults. And so that's why we think it's really important to study. Now, generally people ask me, why is it that I, in particular, am doing this study? And I think I always say that there are two answers, because there are. The first is a scientific one, which is that I've long been interested in the fact that that one of the things that a child has to figure out when they're born into the world is why all these grown-ups seem to care so much about some kinds of people and not about others. I've really been interested in how do they figure out what those groupings are, and how is it that they find their place in them? How do they figure out what groups they're in? And I think most often we think that, well, somebody tells them, right? So you might learn that you're white or Latina because your parents tell you that. But I think these kids are a really interesting case that says, you know, sometimes there might be some categories where a kid gets a sense of who they are that the people around them don't actually come to that conclusion, right? So these kids, a kid like Harriet came into the world, everyone around her told her she was a boy, and yet she identified as a female. So scientifically, intellectually, that's been my interest. In addition, I was very lucky to make a friend whose child is transgender, and I got to see a lot of the decisions that their family was making, and in particular, as I was trying to learn about the decisions their family was making, I realized as I tried to look to what I thought my field, psychology, should have a lot to say about this, and I realized just how little information there was about the other side. So there is a lot of information about what happens if you put your kid in therapy in order to get them to change their gender identity. And there's a lot of studies that have followed those kids. But what we don't know is the other side. What happens if you say, okay, you can live this way, and I'm going to support you in it? And I realized that this family was looking for information that just really wasn't there. And so I waited and I waited and I waited for somebody to do it. And I sort of had a lot of conversations. And then I started to realize, well, I had this opportunity. I was coming to UW, and this was a real chance to try to do this work myself. Now, who are the participants in our study? Well, so far, the data I'm going to talk about today are going to reflect 32 families. So these are 32 families across the United States. But our actual goal is to track between 100 and 200 families with transgender kids. We recruit them into our study when they're between the ages of 3 and 12, and they're all prepubescent when they start the study. So far, we've been very fortunate that we've had more than 200 families reach out, interested from across the country. The dark blue states here are states where we've already included participants from those states in our studies. The light blue ones are families that have reached out. There's a little bit, I noticed, of similarity between the laws that we saw in Mickey's talk and who has actually contacted us. So maybe one additional benefit of laws is that it helps parents to have some maybe words for the things their children are experiencing, and maybe just opens their minds a little bit. So these are the states so far that we've had a chance to get in touch with, and we've been flying around the country, getting a lot of frequent flyer miles, trying to reach all of these families. And in our work, we are kind of guided by 3 primary questions. Now, the first one I think of as kind of the smallest question. This is the question that I am confronted with every single time I talk about this project, on a plane to the person next to me, or to friends. Even a lot of quite liberal friends will say, are these kids really transgender? often they say, you know, couldn't these kids be pretending? Couldn't they just be saying that? You can say whatever you want. Are they confused? And we see this in popular media as well. So, for example, there was a Dr. Phil show that was about kids that are a lot like those in the video that I showed you. And this was actually titled Gender Confused Kids. In addition, any article that you ever see about a transgender child, I don't suggest it, but if you do go to the comments section, you will inevitably find a comment like this one. My daughter spent much of the time between ages 2 and 4 wanting to be a kitten, and comparing the experience of a transgender kid to a kid that's pretending to be something else. And so our first question was, could we get any scientific data? I mean, to some extent, we're never going to convince some people, but could we have any data to speak to this question? The second question we've been interested in was whether or not transgender kids show typical development. Now, on the surface, this might seem like a quite surprising question because many people point out that it's not typical to be transgender, right? It's not as common. And in fact, many of those old studies that I was talking about made exactly that conclusion. They said if this, what I, the scientist, think is a boy, is saying they're a girl, then they're by definition not typical. They're not doing things right. But what we wanted to say is, well, what if you think of that kid as the way they are? If they are a girl, does this kid look a lot like other girls who say they're girls? And that's kind of the question that we've been after. And so I'm going to give you a 2-minute overview of what typical gender development looks like. Now, I'm going to keep putting typical in quotes because no 2 kids have the same gender development. But we're going to pretend for a second that the most common gender development is represented by this kid, Jasmine. Now, Jasmine was declared a girl at birth and considers herself through today, she's now actually a grown-up, to be a girl. Now, if Jasmine was typical, what you'd see is really between the ages of 2 and 3, kids usually start to verbalize what their gender identity is. This is very typical. Kids will say things like, I'm a girl. Then between about the ages of 3 to 6 is this phase that I call the frilly dress stage. And during the frilly dress stage, some of you might be familiar with this, you often see about 50% or more of kids, especially girls, go through this phase where they're very obsessed with pink and frilly and sparkles and all of those things. And you often see the flip side for boys at this same age. So boys often want to avoid everything pink and want to, you know, some of them go through a formal wear phase or other kinds of like asserting their boyness. Then we see this chill out a little bit. And we see in the kind of elementary age, which is the group I'm going to focus on today, we often see more behaviors related to gender segregation. So if you go into, for example, a first grade class at recess, what you often find is that a lot of the girls hang out together and a lot of the boys hang out together. Now, not everyone, but you often see kids preferring to hang out with kids of their same gender. You also see them, for example, prefer to play with toys that are kind of marketed to their gender. And so we can start to look at, one of the questions we can look at is how these kinds of patterns look in a kid who's transgender compared to a kid who's not. And the final question that we can't answer today, but we hope to eventually answer is, in what ways are these kids similar to or different from the previous generation or previous generations ago of transgender people? What will their lives be like? What is the impact of early in your life being supported in your identity? And that's one of really the key questions, I think, for us. Now, who are the participants? So as I said, I'm going to tell you about the first 32 kids who were 5 to 12 years of age in our study. And they're going to be kids we're going to use as an example today, this kid Harriet. Harriet's about the right age and also is transgender. And like Harriet, all the kids I'm going to talk about today are living as they're expressed as their gender identity. They present their gender identity to others, and now they are at least receiving full support, irrespective of what happened earlier. Now, we do have a couple of different subgroups here. So we have some kids that are living what might be called stealth. And what we mean by this is, for example, the other kids at school don't know they're transgender. Maybe they just think Harriet's a girl like every other girl in their class. Others are living very openly. So sometimes this happens for practical reasons. Maybe they went to kindergarten and first grade and second grade as, say, a boy, and their classmates thought they were a boy, and then they showed up at whatever the next grade, third grade, presenting as a girl. So this generally, kids can usually figure out that that means that the kid is probably transgender, even if they don't have the word for it. Others are living openly because their families and them have decided that that's the way they want to live, and so they tell other people that they're transgender. And we compare this group of kids to two other groups in our study. The first are a group of what we call age and gender matched controls. These are kids who aren't transgender, but for every one of those 32 kids, they have a pair. So we're going to pretend Harriet and Jasmine are a pair here. So Jasmine, again, is not transgender. And also at the group level, they're matched on IQ and family income as well. Then we have a third group, which are actually the siblings of our transgender participants. So kids like Harriet's sister here. And these are kids that are the same ages. And they live, obviously, in a family with a transgender kid. So they're familiar with the concept that there are people who are transgender, but they themselves are not. This allows us to also look at things like, are there differences between the kind of families that have transgender kids and are supporting them versus families that don't have transgender kids and don't get confronted with that set of decisions? Now, the first question that we asked them is a kind of straightforward question, I think. We asked them, on the inside, do you feel like you are a boy, a girl, both, neither, it changes over time, or you don't know? The reason we gave them these choices is that we weren't at first sure what they would say. And as I kind of alluded to, we have some participants who actually don't fit into the category transgender, so we wanted to have as many options available as possible. The problem is, nobody's ever asked kids whether they're transgender or not this kind of question when they gave them so many choices. So we actually didn't know what our control participants would say when confronted with this question. And what we found is the majority of them give the response you expect. So if Jasmine and Harriet's sister were asked this, they'd be highly likely to say, I'm a girl. But what you see is that some of them, more than 0%, give some of these other answers. The real question is, what about our transgender kids? Would a kid like Harriet be likely to say that she's a girl? In fact, we see that she is just as likely to say that as any of the other girls in any of the other groups. You can see an assortment of kids give a few other answers, but overall, the most common answer in all the groups is to give what you present every day as your gender identity. We then wanted to look at some of these other developmental effects that we typically see. For example, I alluded to the fact that most kids in this age group prefer to be friends with kids of their own gender. So we presented kids with pairs of kids, and we asked them who they wanted to be friends with. And we could simply look at, were they more likely to pick kids of the same gender or not? And the way this is going to be graphed is that higher positive numbers are going to mean that they picked the kid of their own gender more often. And consistent with a bunch of previous work, control group and siblings both are more likely at this age to prefer to hang out with other kids of their gender. But what about transgender kids? Would they also show this effect, in which case kids like Harriet would be just as likely as kids like Jasmine to prefer other girls, or would they show something else? And what we see is they're totally indistinguishable from the other two groups. Another finding from the literature is that kids tend to prefer toys that are endorsed by other kids of their gender identity. So if they see some girl is playing with some toy, even if they don't know what it is, and they're a girl, they're more likely to want to play with it. So we looked at that as well. We'd present something like, Amanda likes to play with Spoodle, Andrew likes to play with Vasty. These are made-up words. Would you rather play with Spoodle or Vasty? And again, the prediction is that our control groups should both favor toys of their own gender, because that's what the previous literature suggested, not because that's a better choice. And what we see is they do, in fact, show that. The question is, what about our transgender kids? Yet again, we see totally the same as other kids who share their gender identity. Okay, but remember, the first question I presented was, a lot of people say these kids are faking it. And those measures that I just told you about, if you kind of wanted to fake it, You could, right? You could just say you like whatever you like. So what we wondered was, could we look at a less consciously controllable measure? And for this, we use something called the implicit association test. Some of you might have been at Tony Greenwald's talk 2 weeks ago at this very location. And he talked a lot about the implicit association test. I'm just going to talk about it very briefly. But the basic idea of the implicit association test is that it measures the association in our minds between different concepts. So let's take Jasmine again as an example. Now, Jasmine, presumably, thinks of herself as a female. She's always identified that way. So in her mind, the concept of female is probably very closely aligned to the concept of herself, how she thinks of herself. In contrast, she's not transgender. No one's ever probably mistaken her or called her male. She probably isn't likely to think of herself that much as male. Instead, she might think of boys, especially at this age. Everybody remembers the cooties stage, right? So she probably thinks of boys as kind of them. Those kids are different. And so she might associate male and them. And so what the IAT does is it basically measures using a speed measure, a computer task, how fast kids are to make these different pairings, to associate themselves with female versus male. So what that looks like is kids are presented with a computer. There are 2 buttons highlighted, and they're asked to sort things. So they're asked, for example, if it looked like this, they'd be asked every time you see a picture of a girl or a word like me, my, myself, mine, that they should hit the button on the right. If instead they see a picture of a boy or a word that's not related to them, like them, their, other, then they should hit the button on the left. And they would do this for a while. So this one, they'd hit the right button. This one, they'd hit the left, right, right. Then, partway through, these 2 things would switch sides. So now they have to, on the right side, hit that button every time they see a girl or a picture of a word that's like not me. Instead, and if they see a picture of a boy or a word like me, they would hit the button on the left. So that would look like this. So girl, again, is on the right, myself on the left, boy on the left, other on the right. Oh, sorry, yeah, on the right. What we traditionally find in this measure when it's done with adults or with kids is that if you're a boy, you're much faster on average to do these trials that look like this than you are to do that first set that I showed you, because you're more likely to associate me with boys. If instead you identify as a girl, you're much more likely to be faster at the first set and slower at this set. So that's what we can basically look at, the speed with which people do these different things. One nice thing is that the kids often have no idea why they're sorting these pictures. So all those concerns that these kids are somehow, faking and all of that, that generally is, this task is quite hard to fake, and it's especially hard for young kids who don't understand what it is. So what I'm going to do is walk you through what the data could have looked like, and then I'm going to tell you what they actually looked like. So the way that this is computed, again, we're going to say positive numbers are going to mean that they associate themselves with their gender identity they present as every day. And what we would expect here is that both control groups, for example, kids like Jasmine would associate themselves with female. That would be a positive score. But for transgender participants, there are at least 3 possible hypotheses. One is that maybe these critics are right. Maybe these kids are pretending they're just saying whatever they want, but they really identify in their mind when they think of themselves as their natal sex. If that were true, what we'd expect is a bar that went down, because that's the opposite of what they're expressing publicly. Another possibility is that maybe these kids are confused. They just don't understand, or they don't identify with either male or female, which is also possible. Or maybe they identify as both male and female, right? So maybe they see themselves as both. If that was the case, we would expect a bar that's really close to 0, because those 2 sets of categorizations would be just as fast. The third possibility is that maybe transgender children identify even implicitly as their gender identity. If that's the case, what we would expect is a bar that looks more like this. So what did we find? Well, thankfully, we found exactly what we expected with our control participants, telling us that this measure did indeed seem to work with them. What about our transgender kids? what you see is yet again, they're statistically indistinguishable from the other two groups. So to pull all these findings together, let's think about Harriet. So if Harriet was like the typical kid in our study, what we can say is if you gave me just their data, I never knew what kid it was, I could not tell you if those data came from Harriet, from Jasmine, or from Jasmine's sister. All I could tell you is that they didn't come from her brother, and they didn't come from her dad. That's about the only thing that I could tell you. That is, on every single measure, these transgender kids who were supported in their identity were indistinguishable from the other kids who share their gender identity. So if we go back to our guiding questions, are these kids really transgender? Well, they certainly don't seem to be confused or pretending. They certainly seem, by all the measures we've used, both explicit measures and implicit measures, we see a lot of consistency in how they're identifying. And they identify just as much as any other, in this case, girl, would. What about typical development? Again, so far, we actually looked at a few more measures than these. In every single measure we've had, we cannot distinguish what might be considered a typical girl from a transgender girl on any of these measures. What about in terms of their similarity to the previous generation? That one we just don't know yet because we need to keep following these kids. So what I basically told you is about a race we're running, and right now we're at the starting line. We're just getting the tiniest bit of data. We are very fortunate that we've had a lot of families reach out to us and have been willing to let us ask questions of them and their families and their kids. We have a lot of data ongoing, looking at things like mental health and how those are related to support. And what we hope is 10 years from now, we're going to be able to answer those big questions about what these kids' lives are going to look like, so that a family that has a transgender kid or realizes they have a transgender kid 10 years from now can actually look to the scientific literature and become informed about it. Now, at the Trans Youth Project, as I said, our goal is to track between 100 and 200 kids across the country through adolescence and, with funding, one day into adulthood. We want to compare their development to a group of what we call matched controls. We want to answer questions about basic gender development as well as questions about mental health and well-being. And we also want to study what are often called gender nonconforming kids. So we've been fortunate that some of these families have reached out to us too. These are families who maybe their kid does not identify as the other sex, but these are kids who show behavior that people don't typically associate with boys and girls. And we can look at their development as well. We also have a lot of goals related to education and outreach. For example, we're doing one of them right now, which is to try to educate the public about transgender children. I'm surprised every time I talk to people about this research, how many people say things like, "You can be transgender and a kid?" That just boggles people's minds that there are such things as transgender 3-, 4-, and 5-year-olds. Also, a huge barrier people face that Mickey alluded to is discrimination, right? In the case of transgender people, I think that overt stuff happens all the time. As I said at the beginning, half of the adults had experienced being fired or not hired for things because they're transgender, and nearly everyone had experienced harassment. This is true in schools as well. Though many of our families are very fortunate that they've been able to find environments for their kids that don't seem to be experiencing bullying, which again is going to be really exciting to follow these kids. Another thing that we felt very lucky because a lot of these families live in places or under circumstances where they can't be public about their identity, and many of them have expressed to us that participating in research allows them to be public. It allows them to contribute to a public discussion about transgender people. And so that's one of the things that we're excited that we can contribute in this way. And finally, we hope to serve as a hub to connect families to one another. We have families in all kinds of life circumstances. I didn't mention it, but we have families of every racial and ethnic group. We have families that are in all kinds of economic circumstances. We have a much more diverse sample than I first expected. And one of the real joys has been being able to put people in touch with other people, because many of these kids have never met a kid like them. And so getting that opportunity to put them in touch has been great. So before I go, I want to thank the 3 people who have contributed the most to this project. Aidan Key, who's the director of gender diversity here in Seattle and does tremendous work in schools, in organizations, and in families to help support transgender and gender nonconforming youth. Nick Eaton is a professor at Stony Brook University who's in clinical psychology. And our project coordinator, Maddie Demoelle, without whom none of this would have happened, because she plans every trip and is in touch with every family and really makes this all function and happen. I also want to thank some of the organizations who have helped us with recruiting, folks who have given us their photos to use, all of the families who have participated, and the folks who have supported this research. So if you have any additional questions, we have a website, transyouthproject.org. And with that, I'm happy to take some questions.
Great job. We're happy to take questions if people want to go to the microphone.
Hi, I was just wondering if you've done any research with kids who are intersex or who have genitals that don't conform with one or the other gender norm?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've thought about wanting to do that. I'm very much interested in that topic, and I see it intersect in interesting ways with this research. But given that it took me 1.5 years to get 32 families for my current study, I haven't quite yet reached a point where I'm ready to also try to recruit another sample. That would be a very big challenge, but it's like on my to-do list. So I really hope so, because there's really, I mean, there's very little work on transgender kids, and there is much less work on anything but kind of really basic biological development in intersex kids. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yep. Hi.
Do you, at this stage, have there been any differences or similarities, differences, I guess, between the stealth young children and those who are openly identified as transgender? And do you anticipate, studying that over long term?
Absolutely. So that's one of the grants I hope to write soon to send to the NIH, because in psychology we have a long history, well, a recent long history, about studying things about hidden stigma and the kinds of costs of having to hide a part of yourself from other people. And I think that there are, in the case of young kids, pluses and minuses to both strategies. I think obviously if no one knows you're transgender, you don't get bullied about being transgender. But you do have that cost, right, of always worrying, and some of the parents have talked to us about worrying that someone's going to find out. And that's taxing on the kids, that's taxing on the siblings, that's taxing on the parents. But of course, being out is not an option in a lot of communities, I would say most communities in this country right now, especially if you're a young person. So I think that there's reasons why people have to, but I think that the psychological consequences of those two things might be really different, because we see bullying having different impact than kind of concealment. So I think,
I have so many questions, it's hard to narrow it down to just one.
I do too.
And it's
so
hard
it's
to put that one out, because it's kind of strange. But one of my large concerns is that there are a lot of estrogenic type chemicals in our environment in this country. And I'm wondering if this is affecting the neural development of kids, so that even if they don't have bodies that are intersex or that appear to be intersex, I'm wondering if it's affecting their neurological development. Just the great increase in the use of soy in the diet, and soy has a lot of estrogenic properties.
Yeah.
And I fed my son a soy formula and lots of tofu, and he never said, "I'm a girl, Mom," but he's 35 now, and we've had some very interesting conversations.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think one of the real mysteries for scientists is that we don't yet know exactly what causes people to identify as transgender. There are studies that suggest a bunch of different possibilities. So some studies have looked at hormonal differences. Some people have speculated about hormonal differences in the womb. There are some folks who have looked at, neural differences. What I can say about estrogen in particular is that we see transgender people that are both people who identify as female and people who identify as male. So I don't think it's quite as simple as like there's one thing like eating more soy. So I think like a lot of things, these things are probably really complex interactions between, various biological mechanisms and other kinds of things. So we just don't know, but I know that there are more and more research labs getting interested in this question and looking at the neurobiology of gender. So hopefully we'll have an answer at some point. Yeah.
Hi, fabulous talk.
Thanks.
So I first of all just want to say that like there's a lot of different ways to like relate to your body and stuff like that. So this is by no means like generalizable, but like I know a lot of people who like had complete social support when they were growing up, but these specific trans individuals, their sort of psychological suffering was rooted in the fact that sort of like when they looked in the mirror, that wasn't their body. And so it was more sort of rooted in their psychological experience of like experiencing their body as kind of separate from social factors. So I'm curious if that's sort of like a factor in your study and like whether you intend to look at that.
Great question. So yes, we are tracking kids. So we intentionally picked kids prepubescently because most of aside from the kind of point of social transition, most of the major decisions happen pubertally. And so some of our families are, for example, looking into various hormonal options, which are available in some communities in some parts of the world. I do think that is likely true, and I do certainly tentatively have some data to suggest as kids get closer to puberty, for example, a lot of these things become harder, which would be suggested by the fact that also our bodies change more around that time. So I think that there are definitely likely to be psychological costs of not having the body that you believe yourself to have or deserve. And so I think that that certainly plays a role. But I guess I wouldn't say that doesn't also mean obviously social support is super important as well. So we're going to be able to hopefully look at those in a few different ways. Obviously we don't do experiments. We don't manipulate these things in the way that a lot of Mickey's studies on discrimination can. But we will be able to measure them and look at them. So
Thank you.
Great.
Let's see if we can do all 4 questions, depending on how long your answers
Okay.
are.
I'll go fast.
So my question kind of dovetails with that a little bit. So you end at 12 or you go beyond that?
So we recruit participants. They have to be prepubescent when the study starts, but then we're going to follow them through adolescence and all of that.
So my question is kind of similar or in that vein of will you be studying what it looks like for them to choose hormonal treatment, surgery, not choosing any of it, and kind of the comparative data between that?
Yes, exactly what we hope to do, which is why we wanted to recruit them all before any of those decisions had been made, and then we're going to follow them irrespective of what decisions or not are made. So,
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Also kind of dovetails, and also maybe a little too early to tell, but I'm curious if you have any suspicions or thoughts about what might be different based not only on social support, but the possibility of essentially changing puberty before it starts, right? Because one of the things that happens is that a lot of transgender individuals are facing all this discrimination, not because they're out verbally, but because they're clocked, so to speak, as trans. And from my work, I know that a lot of these kids are managing to have either the puberty of the gender they want or to not have the puberty of the gender they don't want. So maybe taking, for example, estrogen blockers, but not taking testosterone, or maybe doing both, just as an example. And so I'm just curious what you think that difference might look like.
Totally. I think it's huge. And I think that is one of the many reasons why I think these kids' lives are going to be so different, not just because as young children they were supported, but because some of them will never have that or will be unlikely to have the experience for people on the street to walk by and know that they are transgender, because some of them will be receiving hormone blockers and cross-sex hormones, or whatever you want to call them. They will have bodies that nobody knows are transgender unless they want somebody to know that they are transgender. And so surely a lot of the discrimination that happens because people can be identified. If you don't know if someone's transgender, you can't really discriminate against them when employing them or firing them or whatever. So I think that the world is going to be very different, which is why I think they're gender pioneers.
Hi. So I'm curious if one of the indicators of gender development is toy selection, then where does that leave the boys who want to play with princesses and fairies? And if they're boys who are born boys and they're not trans, what are they?
Great question, great question. So yeah, so I want to be clear that those are averages. So we have in any sample of kids, whether they are going to identify as gay, straight, trans, categories that we don't have today but will exist when they're older, some of them show preferences that we usually assign to the other gender, but a lot of them don't. So that's why it's an average. But we are tracking, in fact, we have a bunch of kids that I didn't talk about who are, for example, NATO boys who say I'm a boy, but have all female friends, prefer toys that typically we associate with girls, and, you know, love their feather boa, and, you know, but have all these preferences that we typically assign female and are perfectly happy boys. And so we'll learn something about what they grow up to identify as.
Last question?
Do you have any families in which you see two or more transgenders, not necessarily in the nuclear family, but more extended? Is there any genetic
We don't know.
hint?
We don't know if there's a genetic hint. There's some research that sometimes suggests there is. In our particular families, I can't think of a family that has two transgender kids. We do have what might be thought of as the opposite case. We do have some families with twins, where one, including identical twins, where one kid identifies as transgender and the other does not. So that's a tidbit for everybody to chew on. As we
Do you have
Maybe a
DNA
great place
sample?
to leave it off.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great. Thank you very much again.